Chapter 7. A Town Went Mad. From Moldy Bread. Saint-Esprit in southern France, something began to go terribly wrong. A man woke, screaming that snakes were crawling through his bedroom walls. Another ran through the streets convinced he was being chased by demons. In a farmhouse nearby, a teenage boy lashed out violently at his family. Before collapsing in convulsions, an elderly man hurled himself from a second-story window, broke both legs. Later, he would claim he had seen flames devouring his bed by nightfall. Dozens of residents were raving, convulsing, weeping, or cowering behind doors, and no one knew why Saint-Esprit was not large, a quiet town. Just over 4,000 people nestled near the Rhône River. It had existed since medieval times, its name drawn from the Holy Spirit, and its life revolving around vineyards, farms, and stone bakeries that had fed families for generations. That August the air was hot, and still most villagers were just beginning their day when the first wave of symptoms appeared. But by mid-morning, the hospital was overwhelmed. People arrived with fevers and stomach cramps, expressions and violent behavior. Some were catatonic, others screamed. Animals fire invisible shapes. At least one man was tied to a bed to keep him from clawing at his own face. Doctors from nearby towns were summoned. The local authorities, caught off guard, began keeping informal tallies. How many had fallen ill? How many had died over the course of a few days? More than 250 people showed symptoms. Of those, around 50 were institutionalized. 7 died. The cases ranged in severity. Some suffered only temporary confusion or nausea. Others seemed to lose their grip on reality altogether at first. Holocaust theories multiplied: contaminated food, chemical poisoning, criminal sabotage. There were whispers of water contamination, insecticide residue, even mass hysteria. Some wondered if the wine had turned. Others suspected a pesticide accidentally been sprayed too close to the food supply for the families of the dead and the afflicted. The questions were immediate and urgent, the answers slow and unsatisfying. But again and again, one item kept appearing in each household story. Bread. Saint-Esprit had only a few bakeries, and most residents bought their loaves from one particular shop that sourced flour from a regional distributor. Nearly every victim had eaten from the same batch of bread in the same 24-hour window. Doctors and scientists turned their attention to the possibility of food poisoning, not from bacteria or rot, but from a toxin, specifically from a fungus. Months after the event, French investigators concluded that the flour used in that week's baking had been contaminated with ergot. Ergot is a fungus that grows on rye and other grains under certain moist conditions. To the naked eye, it can look like a blackened growth along the grains, tip hard, horn-shaped, and brittle. But its effects are anything but subtle when ground into flour and consumed. Ergot releases alkaloid compounds into the body, chemical cousins to LSD. In high doses it causes irritism, a form of poisoning known in the Middle Ages as Santenay's fire. Its symptoms are well documented: burning sensations, muscle spasms, violent hallucinations, and psychological breakdown. In older outbreaks it sometimes led to gangrene and death. Europe had seen irritism during the 10th and 11th centuries. Outbreaks swept through rural regions, often during wet summers when the fungus thrived. Victims spoke of their limbs burning from within, of flesh turning black, of visions both ecstatic and horrifying. Pilgrimages were made to shrines in hopes of healing. Ergot, feared and named but not fully understood by 1951. In an age of penicillin and modern science, such a thing seemed unthinkable. But post-war France, a country rebuilding from deprivation, food shortages had persisted. Through the 1940s, rationing was still a recent memory. Grain supplies were stretched thin, sometimes hastily stored or imported with less scrutiny. The flour that reached Pan Saint-Esprit may have come from a source that overlooked signs of contamination or that failed to fully remove infected grain, whether by accident or oversight. A dangerous fungus, basic food, its daily bread. Reports from those who lived through the incident are vivid and unsettling. One farmer said he saw his heart torn from his chest by spectral hands. A woman claimed she was suffocating under a pile of invisible rocks. A postal worker ran down the street shouting that he was being eaten alive by tigers. Some screamed uncontrollably. Others wandered glassy-eyed into fields and refused to return. Children were seen laughing, then sobbing, then collapsing. Doctors and nurses worked through the nights. There were few established treatments. Sedatives were given to those who could not be calmed. Some patients were locked away for their safety. Rumors spread quickly of madness, of possession, of divine punishment. The town named for the Holy Spirit now found itself enveloped in confusion and fear. Eventually, time and distance quieted the panic. The bread supply was traced and halted. No further cases appeared. But the damage had been done. Livelihoods were disrupted, reputations shaken. Some of those affected fully recovered long after the official reports had been filed. The memory lingered in testimonies, in silence, in the way people looked at the familiar shape of a loaf. Decades later, the case of Pan Saint-Esprit would resurface in darker theories. Some claimed it had been a covert chemical experiment, perhaps part of Cold War mind control research. The most persistent claim pointed toward CIA and its known interest in psychedelic substances, including LSD. Under the MKULTIRA program. According to this theory, accident, but selected as a test site, proponents cited discrepancies, records, oddities, and timing gaps in the documentation, but such claims have not been substantiated. No firm evidence has emerged to show an intentional experiment. The more widely accepted explanation remains ergot. Its history, its chemistry, its pattern. It had happened before. In other places it would happen again on smaller scales. The bread was tainted, the people suffered. The event was strange, not because it defied reason, but because it revealed. Easily the past can return through something as simple as a meal. Even today, the bakery where the bread was sold is remembered not for its crust or its craft, but for a week in 1951 when the town lost its grip on reality. The building still stands, its ovens long cold. At the edge of town, some of the old residents still speak of it in low voices, of the fear in their parents' faces, of the screams at night, of neighbors walking into walls babbling about beasts only they could see, and of the moment sharp and unforgettable when Pan Saint-Esprit became a place where bread could betray. Mine Chapter 8. People used to bathe in mercury. It gleamed like nothing else in the known world, cold and metallic, yet fluid as water. Mercury, called quicks, slid across surfaces without soaking them. The candlelight of early laboratories and palaces, it moved with eerie precision, refusing to be grasped, reflecting the world in silvery fragments for ancient alchemists and emperors. This was no ordinary element. Immortal in ancient China, the pursuit of immortality was not metaphor. Braided into one, to live forever was to defy the cycle of heaven and earth, to perfect the body so thoroughly it could resist decay, to align one's own essence. Was not mere chemistry, it was deeply embedded in philosophy, with a balance of yin and yang, the movements of the five elements, and the search for harmony were all seen as essential to human longevity. And in that vast constellation of metals and minerals, Mercury stood apart. It was thought to embody both yin and yang, possessing the passive fluidity of water and the shimmering brightness of metal. Alchemists believed it purify, stabilize, and bind other substances. Its behavior was mysterious, resistant to fire, quick to move, impossible to pin down its permanence. Liquid form was seen as a key to transforming the mortal body into something more refined, more enduring. To ingest it, to breathe its vapor, to bathe in its essence, was to invite its properties into the blood. During the Qin dynasty, ideas were not only whispered in forested temples or mountain caves, they were brought directly into the heart of imperial rule. At their center shaped the world around him with unmatched ambition. Qin Shi Huang, the first emperor, he unified China with ruthless precision. He built roads, standardized currency, and script his desire to conquer death from his palace. The emperor dispatched envoys to the ends of the earth. Expeditions sailed east in search of the fabled Isles of the Immortals, where it was said that perfect sages lived untouched by time. Scholars and mystics were summoned to court, ordered to produce elixir, tablets that could extend life beyond the limits of the body. Taoist priests, court alchemists, and herbal physicians were given resources and authority. Some mixed potions from rare roots and minerals, others turned to metals, gold, cinnabar, and which mercury could be extracted was especially prized. Heated and distilled it, released quicks which could be collected and purified. The process dangerous, the fumes toxic. but the rewards, it was believed, were transcendent. Cinnabar symbolized transformation when reduced to mercury. It was thought to have passed through a sacred change. Alchemists offered the emperor elixirs composed of mercury and gold dust, sometimes bound with honey or ground into pills. They promised him renewal not just of the body but of spirit. Claimed to arrest aging others, to awaken hidden energy in the vital organs when taken in sequence, when matched to lunar cycles and breathwork rituals. They were said to lift the soul towards celestial alignment. We do not know precisely what Qin Shi Huang ingested, but historical accounts, particularly from the records of the grand historian by Sima Qian, that, in his later years, the emperor consumed a steady regimen of supposed immortality drugs. His behavior grew erratic. He became secretive, fearful of death, more dependent on omens and dreams. In his final journeys across his empire, supplies for preparing elixirs in the summer of 210 BCE, while traveling in the eastern provinces, he collapsed. For weeks, to avoid unrest, may have been hastened by the very potions meant to preserve him. Mercury is silent in its destruction. Accumulates in the body, crossing into the brain, interfering with nerve signals, weakening organs, tremors, paranoia, confusion. These are its heralds in the emperor's last months. Such symptoms could easily have been seen as omens or spiritual imbalance. Life did not end with his death. His tomb was constructed on a scale worthy of myth. According to records from the Han Dynasty, palaces, towers, rare treasures, and mechanical traps. Most famously, army, thousands of life-sized clay soldiers, each uniquely crafted, arranged in martial formation beneath the earth. But deeper inside the tomb, according to historical descriptions, was a vast underground chamber representing the empire itself. Rivers of flowing mercury were said to run through it, simulating the great waterways of China. The ceiling was inlaid with pearls to represent the stars. The emperor, it was believed, would rule in death. By currents of immortal substance, modern archaeological surveys, using soil sampling and remote sensing, have detected unusually high levels of mercury around the sealed burial mound at Linton, near Xi'an. The tomb itself remains unopened out of concern for preservation and risk. But the traces suggest that the legends were not fantasy, whether those subterranean rivers still flow, or whether they ever did. In motion is uncertain, but mercury was undeniably there. It was not only used in the emperor's afterlife. Ritual texts the time suggests that mercury may have been poured into ceremonial vessels used in purification rites, or applied to the body before burial in some cases. High-ranking individuals were interred with bowls of mercury beside them, perhaps as a final defense against decay, or as a symbolic bridge between this world and the next. The irony is not subtle. The very element, time, the danger was invisible. There was no understanding of toxicity as we know it. There was only the search for essence, for the divine order hidden in nature. And metals were more than inert substances. They carried meaning, power, resonance, in Deus. Theory: the human body was a miniature universe containing within it elements, forces, and channels that echoed the rhythms of the cosmos. Alchemy was a means of tuning the body to those rhythms. Spiritually pure Mercury was transformative, its fluidity a sign of hidden movement between realms. If one could perfect the internal harmony using such materials, one might transcend ordinary limits. The practice continued beyond the Qin dynasty under the Han, and in later centuries. Experiment with Mercury and its compounds. Some wrote treatises on dosage, purity, timing. Others disappeared into mountains to test their theories in isolation. The line between medicine and magic blurred easily, and across tombs from imperial China evidence of Mercury has been found again. Traces of a belief that something divine could be touched through metal. The world remembered Qin Shuang, restlessness in the face of death. His monuments remain buried and immense, but their silence is laced with ambition to sculpt a future where he would always rule. And at the heart of that dream was Mercury shining, flowing deadly, eternal, in the cold, dark chambers beneath his burial mound. If the legends are true, rivers of quick still run through his empire of clay, unseen, unspoken, sealed beneath layers of soil and stone. An emperor's echo glinting softly in the dark. 9. 19th century Tennessee. In the winter darkness of rural Tennessee, at the turn of the 19th century, on the walls, knocking from within the wooden beams, soft sounds like a rat chewing beneath the floorboards. At first, they dismissed it. Mouse, a wind-blown branch, the ordinary settling of a house, echoed through empty rooms, and before long, the Bell family came to believe that something had entered their home that could not be explained. The land was quiet farmland near Red River in what is now Adams, Tennessee. John Bell, the patriarch, had moved his family there from North Carolina, building a house and raising children on a stretch of fertile land. They were not isolated, scattered across rolling hills, the kind of place where a story could move quickly by word of mouth. The whispers began to spread. It was more than noise. The presence, whatever it was, seemed to target the youngest daughter. Betsy was pinched, slapped, and pulled by her hair. Invisible hands left red marks across her arms and neck. The family reported seeing objects fly through the room, shoes, stones, and irons from the hearth. And then the voice came. It started as indistinct muttering but grew stronger over time. Soon it was clear, even articulate. It called itself many names, but came to be known as the Bell. Members themselves, it claimed to know secrets it had no business knowing. It spoke of neighbors' sins, whispered predictions, grieving woman. Other times it laughed, harsh, gleeful, mocking. The voice had a presence, but no face. It responded to questions, interrupted conversations, and once it was said, recited to sermons delivered simultaneously in different churches, miles apart. The house became a destination. People came from miles around to hear the ghost speak. Ministers, skeptics, neighbors. They sat in the Bell parlor waiting, and many swore they heard it. Themselves the voice answered their questions. It told them who they were and what they had come to see. It knew things it should not. No, over time the legend moved far beyond the fields of atoms. The most famous visitor was said to be General Andrew Jackson, later the 7th President of the United States in 1819. While still a military figure of growing national fame, Jackson reportedly traveled with a small party to visit the Bell farm drawn by tales of the talking spirit. According to the story, one of Jackson's men was skeptical and brought a pistol loaded with silver bullets, claiming he could stop any ghost. But before the group reached the house, their wagon froze on the road, its wheels stuck without, 'cause the horses strained, could not pull it forward. Then a disembodied voice was heard, mocking, cold, amused. "All right, General, let the wagon move on. I will see you again tonight." Wagon jerked forward as if released that night. It said Jackson and his men were tormented, slapped, cursed, shouted at, and by dawn they left in haste. "I'd rather face the British," Jackson is quoted as saying, though no formal record survives. But beneath the spectacle and the folklore, there was a darker current. John Bell, the family's patriarch, had begun to decline. He complained of a stiff tongue, strange spells of trembling and confusion. His speech faltered. He struggled to eat, and all the while the spirit taunted him, "Old Jack Bell is going to die," it would say again and again. In its cold sing-song tone, it called him names. It cursed him openly, and had promised to attend his funeral. December of 1820, John Bell died. The cause was listed as a nervous disorder, but the family later reported finding a strange vial near his deathbed. Spirit claimed it had poisoned him. It told those in the house that it had slipped the contents into his medicine when one of the sons offered the remaining liquid to the family cat. The animal died within minutes. The bottle was thrown into the fire. The flames turned blue at Bell's funeral. The voice was heard again, loud and mocking, singing, drinking songs through the ceremony. It disrupted the prayers, shouted obscenities. But the story did not end with death. In the months that followed, tales emerged of the Bell. Accounts say that during a legal proceeding involving the Bell family's property, witnesses claimed to hear the spirit testify. One version holds that during a land dispute, identifying the location of a document that settled the case, others said it mocked the judge, predicted the verdict, or recited legal precedent. Whether any of this was formally recorded is unclear. Court transcripts of the time do not mention a ghost. Descendants insist that the voice spoke clearly and that no one present doubted what they heard. It would not have been entirely out of place in early 19th century. America, especially on the frontier, supernatural belief occupied a space beside religion, medicine, and law. Folklore was not confined to stories told around a fire, spirits, curses, signs. They were discussed, openly taken seriously. Communities turned to ministers and magistrates alike to address both the seen and unseen. And in a town where dozens had heard the ghosts speak, cursed, the line between belief and evidence had already begun to bend. The bell, which returned periodically in the years that followed, but never with the same intensity. In 1828 it allegedly visited John Bell's son Richard, promising to reappear at intervals. Some say promise, others say the voice faded. The Bell property changed hands, the family scattered. But the land remained marked today. The cave on the old Bell farm draws visitors year-round. Guides speak of voices in the dark, sudden winds, strange touches on the skin. Skeptics call it legend, believers call it truth. What remains is the story, layered, echoing, unchanged in its power to unsettle. A girl tormented, a man cursed, a voice in the air that would not be silenced. And once, in a courtroom in Tennessee, they say it answered when called. Chapter 10, the oldest balloon in a museum is still inflated in a glass case, tucked quietly among the artifacts of early science and Victorian curiosity. Floats a small pale balloon, bright or shiny. Its surface has dulled with age, its skin slightly yellowed, but it is whole, it is sealed, and it is still inflated. The tag beneath it reads, "Toy balloon presented to Prince Albert Edward, 1840. Queen Victoria, who would grow into Edward III, has endured for more than 180 years in a world where balloons are designed to last an afternoon. Weak if protected, this one has defied expectation, time, and entropy. It hovers in its case at the Science Museum in London. The day it was first given to a royal child who had just turned a few months old. The year was 1840. Victoria had only recently taken the throne. She was 21, newly married to Prince Albert and already pregnant with her firstborn. The birth of Albert Edward in November was both a private joy and a public event. The child would be heir to the British Empire, which even then was stretching into its global shape. In the midst of ceremony, there were gifts from across the kingdom: silver rattles, embossed books, delicately stitched clothing, and among them something unusual. Balloon. At that time, balloons were not made of synthetic latex or plastic, but of rubber, or in earlier forms of animal membrane. Pig bladders had long been used as toys, inflated and tied, sometimes painted. By 1840, commercial rubber balloons had just begun to appear. They were recent inventions made possible by the discovery of how to vulcanize rubber, treating it with sulfur and heat to make it more stable and elastic. The process was still novel. Charles Goodyear's patent was still being finalized. The idea of a balloon that could hold its shape, resist brittleness, and be safely sealed was bordering on magical. That such a thing would be gifted to a prince makes sense. It was new, playful, a marvel of industrial progress. Childhood. It's not hard to imagine the balloon's arrival. Perhaps wrapped in silk, perhaps presented with ceremony by a courtier. toy. It was a symbol of invention, a nod to the changing world. The young prince would inherit. Palace or Windsor would not have noticed, but someone thought to keep the balloon. Perhaps it was tucked into a chest with other royal keepsakes the way. Mothers and governors saved first shoes, first curls of hair, christening robes. It might have rested in a dry, dark drawer. Adolescence only rediscovered decades later. The remarkable thing is not just that it still exists, it is that it is still inflated rubber. Known for its endurance over time, it breaks down exposed to oxygen light and fluctuating temperatures. It becomes brittle, shrinks, crumbles. But this balloon survived, preserved in ideal conditions with minimal exposure to the air, undisturbed by movement or touch. Held the seal, perhaps an unusually tight knot, or even a dab of pitch or resin remained intact. The gas inside, likely simple air, did not leak somehow. Accident. The balloon kept its shape. Its presence in the Science Museum is quiet. It is not among the loud exhibits, the interactive displays, the dramatic engines, or bold prototypes of Victorian engineering. It floats behind glass in the making. The Modern World Gallery. Nearly unremarkable in appearance, but once noticed it holds the gaze, something so delicate, so clearly meant to vanish, still intact. Breath from the 19th century, held perfectly in place for historians and conservators. The balloon is not just a relic, it is a marvel of material endurance. Only of preservation, but of the Victorian urge to keep. The 19th century was filled with collectors' cabinets of curiosities, grew into museums. Hair clippings were framed, teeth stored in lockets, shells catalogued in drawers. Measured not only by calendars but by what could be made to last. Photographs, pressed, flowers, pinned, insects, children's toys. And there was something about childhood that demanded preservation. Albert Edward was the embodiment of future and continuity, with a modern novelty, one that floated, that could be touched and admired, was to bind innovation to inheritance. Whether or not that symbolism was conscious, it remains preserved in the balloon itself. Edward grew. He played misbehave, studied reluctantly. He became known for his social ease, his appetite for leisure, his affairs. Finally died in 1901. Edward ascended the throne at nearly 60. He ruled for only 9 years, and yet the balloon once given to him as a newborn had already survived far longer than that reign over time. Private royal collection to public museum inventory. At some point in the early 20th century, it was catalogued, described, and placed into controlled storage. Became not just a curiosity, but an object of study. Its resilience, an unexpected gift. Few other balloons from the era exist, and none in such condition. It is likely the oldest inflated balloon in the world. No one now knows exactly who made it. It may have come from one of the early London rubber manufacturers. Experimenting with thin sheeting, it might have been handcrafted or a rare example of a short-lived commercial batch. Its survival was never planned. but it happened nonetheless. In a broader context, the balloon sits among other unlikely survivors of the Victorian era. Birth, a glove worn by a queen, a train ticket. Never use these objects. Carry with them the quiet tension of fragility and endurance. They are things that should not have lasted, but did they show how history is not always built of battles and laws? Sometimes it clings to rubber and string, to what was meant to amuse. Child. And then be forgotten. The Science Museum holds many treasures, engines that once moved, empires, tools that mapped the stars, machines that stitched the fabric of modern life, and among them, suspended in time as a breath. From 1840, not a metaphor, not a reconstruction, a literal breath, captured in a balloon, still pushing gently outward. The balloon has no voice, no inscription, remained in its silence. It reminds us of the strange ways memory takes shape, and how even the air from a royal nursery can become an artifact holding its form. Long after the hands that tied it are gone. Chapter 11. Russians once built a giant sun mirror in space on a cold February night. 1993. A thin shaft of light cut silently across the sky over parts of Europe. It was pale like moonlight, but steadier, unnatural. And its precision, off snowy hillsides in France, caught the edge of rooftops in Germany, traced highways below that had never seen sunlight at that hour. Some who saw it thought it was a comet. Others said it was a sign, but it was neither. It was a beam of sunlight, redirected from 240 kilometers above the Earth's surface by a massive mirror launched into space by Russian scientists. The mirror was called Russian for banner, and for a moment it worked. The idea had taken shape in the final years of the Soviet Union, a time when ambition and imagination still stretched outward, even as the system that had launched Sputnik was fracturing under its own weight, with the Cold War ending and funding for the Russian space program shrinking. Engineers, the vast orbital infrastructure that remained Znamia, was born of this strange and shifting moment. Part practical, part visionary. Unprecedented, the concept was simple in its outline, complex in its execution. Deploy a large thin mirror in low Earth orbit, position it to catch the sun and reflect that light down to Earth's surface, not a focused beam like a magnifying glass, but a wide, soft wash of illumination enough to light a city during the night, to reduce energy use, to extend the working day in dark northern latitudes, providing emergency lighting during blackouts, or perhaps even lengthening growing seasons. Farmland Zamia 2 was the first serious test. It was launched aboard a Progress cargo spacecraft and attached to the Mir space station. The mirror itself was a thin sheet of aluminous mire, 20 meters in diameter, delicate as foil, strong as modern materials. Could make it stored in a canister. It was designed to unfold in orbit like a blossom, its petals catching the light of the sun and redirecting it downwards. in a long ellipse of brightness, racing across the Earth. On February 4, 1993, the experiment was carried out. Mirror unfurled successfully for several minutes as it passed over Europe. The mirror reflected sunlight onto the night side of the planet. The beam, traveling at orbital speed, startle and mesmerize in some places. The illumination was said to be as bright as a full moon in others. It was brighter. People stepped outside to see it. Watching the streak of light move across the sky, there were few warnings, fewer explanations. The world wasn't used to artificial stars for the engineers. On the ground, it was a vindication. The experiment had proven that it was possible. The mirror had opened, caught the sun, and painted it. On the night, the next version, Xenomia 2.5, would be larger, 25 meters, and more. Controlled, designed to hover light over specific locations for longer periods, but it never got the chance. In 1999, aboard another Progress ship, as it separated and began its unfurling, something went wrong. The mirror caught on one of the antennae it tore. The material crumpled, tangled. The structure could not deploy after multiple failed attempts to free it. Mission Control gave the order to doorbet the mirror. Burned up on re-entry, the project was cancelled. The mirror never flew again in those years. Russia's space agency was caught between two eras, still drawing on the legacy of Soviet era rockets and stations, but with a fraction of the funding and shifting international priorities. But in the right light, it was also a bold statement that the tools of space could be bent toward peaceful transformation, that technology once shaped for defense could be redirected to illuminate literally the night. The mirror was not a weapon, it was light, turned back toward the Earth. But not everyone was comforted. Even in its brief partial success, raise questions. What would it mean to stretch daylight into the night? How would ecosystems respond? What about the human body, calibrated to circadian rhythms shaped by light and dark? The project's designers spoke of its usefulness during disasters, its potential for regions plunged into winter gloom. But the implications were larger. Was it right to turn the sky into a tool? Environmentalists voiced concern. Astronomers too. Artificial light pollution from space could disrupt observations. Some philosophers and ethicists, silence had its own value. The world had long believed that night followed day, unchanging. What happens when that balance can be engineered? There were precedents, but none had reached so far. The United States had considered orbital reflectors as early as the 1960s. Private companies and academics proposed new versions, swarms of small mirrors, adjustable space shades. But most remain on paper, hampered by technical challenges and regulatory barriers. Xenomia remains the only time sunlight was successfully redirected from orbit to Earth in real time. The Meyer mirror, paper thin but 65 feet wide, it had to survive launch, vacuum temperature swings, and the mechanical stress of unfolding in space. It succeeded briefly. Invention, its failure when it came, was not due to physics, but to fragility, to the delicate edges that tore under tension, to the imperfections of human craft. Those who saw the beam remember it differently. Some recall a gentle light crossing the snow. Remember something eerie, a patch of brightness moving without sound. Unnatural in its speed and direction. Uncertain whether it was a dream. Farmers stepped out of barns and stared scientists. A mirror circling. The planet offering a glimpse of daylight at midnight. The archive of this project now lives mostly in photographs and mission reports scattered in technical journals. And Russian aerospace documents the mirror itself is gone. No trace remains of Zamia, 2 or 2.5 in orbit. What survives is the brief memory of light and the realization that space, so often imagined, touched the Earth not with metal, but with warmth. There's something timeless in the gesture. Since fire was first captured, humans have tried to bring light where there was none: lamps, torches, electricity, and now this sunlight gathered and returned by machines we send into the void. Entirely modern to hold the sun in your hand, or at least its reflection, and use it to chase back the dark. The light passed over Europe in minutes gone. Before most people knew what they had seen, no messages were sent, no records remain of what it illuminated: a field, a town square, the window of a hospital. But for those who looked up that night, something shifted. The stars were still in place, altered not for long, just long enough to remind us what's possible. Chapter 12. There was a government plan for a zombie apocalypse in 2011 deep within the U.S. Strategic Command. A planning document was quietly circulated under the heading CONAP 888 Dominance Operations. It laid out a detailed response framework for a large-scale undead outbreak. The file opened with a clear, almost jarring preamble. This plan was not actually designed as a joke. It was real, thorough, structured, written in the same language and format used for serious threat assessments, and it was about zombies. The United States military creates plans for contingencies, disaster responses, failures of infrastructure. These plans are not predictions, they are exercises in coordination designed to prepare for the unknown by imagining it in vivid detail. CONAP 888 emerged from this logic. According to the authors, the idea came from a recurring challenge in training simulations: how to practice strategic planning at the global level without accidentally simulating war with an actual nation or ethnic group. Zombies solved the problem, as the document puts it. Planners realized that training examples for plans must accommodate the political sensitivities of actual operations. A fictional scenario completely untethered from real-world politics or diplomacy allowed for the full exercise of military imagination. It also allowed for a surprisingly effective means of testing readiness. Logistical flows, chain of command, clarity, moral considerations in chaotic conditions. If you could design a functional response to a zombie outbreak, you could adapt those same frameworks to more grounded, real-world threats. The structure of CONAP 8888 followed the standard format of a joint operational plan. It included a detailed threat, environment assessment, phases of engagement, command and control protocols, logistical support diagrams, and rules of engagement. Each section was written in technical language, familiar to defense analysts and officers alike. The fictional scenario was only a shell. Inside it was a full-spectrum military exercise. The document classified zombies into categories, each presenting different tactical and ethical considerations. There were pathogenic zombies created by infection, nuclear energy, evil magic zombies whose origins were explicitly supernatural. There were also space zombies, the product of extraterrestrial exposure or contamination, and notably vegetarian zombies, harmless, slow-moving, and driven by instinct to consume plants rather than humans. Clearly fictional, each category forced planners to consider the logistics of containment, identification, response protocols, and civilian communication under extreme uncertainty. Threat analysis came first. Urban centers collapsing, transport hubs failing, communication systems disrupted by panic. The plan emphasized the need to establish command centers beyond the reach of infection zones to secure power grids and water sources, to develop biological countermeasures, even in the absence of a known cause. Containment strategies followed: zones of quarantine, checkpoints, field hospitals, deployment of armed forces around strategic infrastructure, integration with civilian government agencies and international allies. CONUP 888 did not treat the outbreak as a fantasy. It approached it with the same procedural seriousness as a natural disaster or chemical attack. Coordination across all branches, Army, Navy, Air Force, Marines, was included. Military police were assigned crowd control duties. Engineers were tasked with fortification. Communications units were to maintain radio. Rules of engagement received particular attention. Zombie combat posed unique legal and moral problems. What if a person had been recently turned? Counted as a hostile act. Was capture feasible? The plan walked through use of force guidelines, balancing the imperative to neutralize threats with the obligation to protect uninfected civilians. The goal was not destruction but stability. The survival protocols extended beyond battle scenarios. Were directives on sanitation, psychological support for troops, food rationing, fuel preservation. The documents simulated a world in collapse, not to entertain. To test the seams of preparation, it was comprehensive. It had to be. At some point someone had to write this plan, and the image is not hard to summon. Officers gathered around a long table, whiteboards filling with maps and projected timelines, markers circling transportation corridors, casualty rates, drafting charts for evacuation timelines. They were not thinking of Hollywood monsters. They were thinking of how to mobilize a joint response crisis, how to move troops without triggering panic, how to hold ground. Uncertain. CONUP 8888 was never classified. It was posted to an internal military network available to planners and trainers, but not widely known outside those circles. That changed in 2014 when it was obtained and published by Foreign Policy magazine. The reaction was immediate. Headlines leaped on the word zombie. Idea of the U.S. military spending time and resources planning for the undead was too strange to ignore. But those who read the full document quickly understood the deeper aim. Military spokespeople clarified its intent. CONUP 8888 was a training tool. It was designed to allow free-form operational planning without the political complications of simulating war with an actual country. It was fictitious on purpose and precisely because it was fictitious. It was useful with zombies. There were no alliances to offend, no treaties to complicate. The exercise was pure abstraction, an elegant problem in command, logistics, and crisis. Attention to detail, the clinical tone, the precision with which the apocalypse was catalogued. That too was part of the exercise too. Take a completely impossible threat and address it as if it were real. Because, in the end, CONUP 888 was never implemented, but its methodology, abstract scenarios, remain common. Alien invasions, mythical pandemics, meteor strikes, these are not indulgences. They are tests of adaptability, of command. Under pressure, they teach officers how to plan when the familiar collapses. The zombie scenario, with all its cinematic baggage, offered something uniquely useful. It stripped away conventional assumptions. There were no political alliances, no ideologies, no negotiations, just a spreading, mindless threat and the question of how to respond with discipline, humanity, and cohesion. It allowed planners to explore the fragility of civil order, the logistics of evacuation, the difficulty of making ethical decisions under duress. The plan's existence also speaks to a larger truth about preparedness, that the most scenarios can often illuminate the most important questions. What happens when cities fail? When communication breaks down? When fear spreads faster than truth? In these questions, the difference between fact and fiction begins to blur. There are few artifacts of military planning quite like CONUP 888888. It is a relic of imagination. Harnessed for discipline, a document written in the plain, urgent language of strategy, describing a war that will never be fought, the outline of a truth that applies to every real crisis. That preparedness is not about guessing, knowing how to respond when the expected never comes. Somewhere in an operations room, a trainer once pointed to a screen, asked an officer to coordinate a response to a fast-moving outbreak in a major city. The officer responded not with disbelief but with a plan, not because he believed in zombies, but because he believed in readiness. The plan is still accessible. War laid out in careful detail, a mirror held up to the machinery of response, and somewhere between the lines, a quiet reminder that even imaginary threats can teach us how to hold the line when the real world begins to break.